So, hello and welcome back. We are embarking upon yet another journey with James Mallory and Mercedes Lackey as we dive in and recap The Phoenix Transformed. It is the third book in the Enduring Flame saga, and it is the final book in this trilogy. And I I know I've said this about a bazillion times, but I really don't know which trilogy I like better. It it does really always depend on, I guess, my frame of mind and my mood and what I'm looking for in a story. This one is so interesting because it's got so many more shades of gray, and it does tend to, just fair warning before we dive into the recapping, this one almost feels like it goes in a little harder on some of the harsh realities of life and a little bit of the brutality of life, and that will be very evident even in the first chapter. It's not that the Obsidian trilogy shied away from the terrors and the harshness of war, but this one almost seems to go harder into it, so fair warning for that. So yeah, other than that, it has been a very cool day, which I'm not actually complaining. Right now, I honestly feel like, I mean, I am a little bit chilly and kind of thinking about putting a shirt under my sweatshirt, but at the same time, this weather is so nice. And again, I hate to say it. I'm sending out all of my good thoughts and good vibes to the people in the path of yet another hurricane. It seems like this year we had, I mean, it started off with Beryl, and she was a little bit less scary than they predicted, but still any hurricane's terrifying. And then it felt like we went through sort of a calm phase, and now all of a sudden we're getting hammered. I My heart goes out to you. I know Georgia got hit, and I don't know if she's even watching these days, but Mopsy J, I saw recently through social media, literally just got her power back, and that's hard. I cannot even imagine. So stay safe, everybody down south, and ride it out as good as you can. And hopefully, this is the last one this year. But yeah, definitely, I'm sending you all of the good thoughts. But that's that's about it. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, it is time to dive into this book. And we're starting with the prologue, which actually has a chapter title. I love how some chapters or some prologues I felt like didn't have a chapter title, but this one does. And the prologue of this is Shadows and Fire. And as with every other prologue, it's not anything to really spend a long time with. In fact, this one, unlike the prologue for book 2 of the Obsidian trilogy, is a nice, short, only like 4 pages long, just kind of catching us up to where we are. It starts off talking about, Tercel and Harrier and two best friends who were all set to begin their journeys towards adulthood. They were leaving their schooling behind and about to embark upon their adult careers when Harrier got an unwanted birthday present, and Tercel decided to start poking into it. Discovered that high magic was actually a thing, and then decided to start experimenting with that. Turns out he had the mage gift, and yeah, things sort of degenerated from there. He started seeing visions of a woman who was not made of fire, but standing in the middle of a lake of fire. And he started realizing that these visions probably weren't actually meant for him. He and Harrier go off on a long journey to try and figure out what to do about these visions that ends up with them with the elves, who tell Tercel that he is the child of prophecy, the destined child, the champion of the light, and they offer him Ankeldar, which comes at a heavy price, and that price is the lives of Germain, Sandalon, Elven King, and Sandalon's dragon Petrovich, but that leaves Tercel with a dragon. At the end of book one, Tercel and Harrier and Ankeldar are heading out of the Elven lands when Kerta, a kind of obnoxious unicorn, comes trotting up with the 3 books of wild magic for Harrier and lets him know that he's going to be a night mage. The first night mage since Kellen Tavadon. Neither boy is entirely thrilled with their fate, but they're trying to do the best they can. Most of book 2 is dealing with Harrier and Tercel trying to figure out where the Lake of Fire is and trying to deal with the fact that the Isvani, the desert people of this world, have all disappeared. Turns out that they've all disappeared because the person being called by the fire woman is Bisochim. He is a wild mage who is bonded to a dragon and has fallen, like all other wild mages, to the lure of eternal life. Not necessarily for him, but for his dragon. His Isvani, he wants to safeguard and protect, but in doing so, he discovers that they aren't meant to live a sedate life in a crammed in area. He sends a group of them out to look for the Nalzindar, which is the only tribe of Isvani people who did not heed Bisochim's call to gather at the Fire Sprite Shrine. So he sends his young hunters out, and along the way, they discover some things that turn them into an army that then invades all of the cities around the Mandirian Desert, one of which happens to contain Tercel and Harrier. There is a battle. Tercel and Harrier are captured, and Ankeldar later on rescues them, which deposits the boys, both of them, squarely in the middle of the Baraleth, the hottest part of the desert, where they meet Shariah and her Nalzindar tribe, who are sheltering in an ancient elven city. The boys and Ankeldar begin exploring Abiyabadashar, this ancient elven city, and they discover quickly that it was made by elves and dragons a very long time ago. Unfortunately, as they're exploring this city, Ankeldar disappears. Tercel says that he's no longer bonded to Ankeldar. He can't sense him anymore. And he and Harrier decide that they probably can't do anything, but there's no point in staying in the city any longer. So they had made plans to head to the Lake of Fire and trust in the wild magic to see what could possibly be done. And that's kind of where we stood at the end of the last book. So, Now it's time to move on to Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled A Terrible Beauty. And Chapter 1 begins with Bisochim and his Isvani people who are at the Fire Sprite Shrine, which I cannot actually pronounce the name of it. It's like Tenchital or Tenchitalal. We're just going to call it the Fire Sprite Shrine because that's easier for me. And we meet one of the young tribesmen. He is one who did not go with the rest of the young hunters. He did not sack the Atreyu cities because he's a weaver. His trade has always been the making of rugs, and he just didn't see the point in going off and searching for the Nalzindar. And then when they all came back talking about war and everything, it just doesn't sit right with him. You know, he knew the people in the Atreyu cities. He went to trade with them. And so he decides that what he needs to do is go and speak with Bisochim. Now, he isn't quite sure how to find Bisochim, but he figures if he goes up to where he's seen Bisochim coming and going from, sort of his private sanctuary, his fortress, that he can probably find it. And this young Nalzindar's name is Narbak. And he just wants to know if Bisochim has a dragon, and everyone has seen that Bisochim does, and all of this stuff happened, how can this be a thing of the balance? So he heads off towards where he hopes that Bisochim can be found. And quoting, "It was with this hope in his heart that Narbak set out toward Bisochim's fortress at the top of the cliffs. Narbak had never been inside Bisochim's great fortress. He did not know anyone who had. He did not know why it should be that a wild mage, servant of the wild magic, an individual who belonged to all tribes and none of them, one of those by who by custom called to no tent, why they should possess a vast stone house larger than the largest house of any city dweller. Narbak did not like to presume to enter such a place, but Bisochim had not been seen upon the plains for many days, and if Narbak wished to have words with him, Narbak must ascend to Bisochim's dwelling." Now, this is quite the journey because Bisochim's little fortress is actually up on top of cliffs right at the lip of the Lake of Fire. None of the Isvani people have actually been up there, but he's going to do it. And it's a good thing that he's been to the Atreyu cities because he knows all about stairs. So he mounts the steps and begins to climb. It's hot. And that's saying something because this Narbak is a desert dweller. He's born and bred in the desert, but it's even hotter here than he's ever experienced. And it keeps getting hotter the higher he goes. Finally, he's nearing the top and he begins to feel little bits of coolness on his face. He's actually familiar with this because that is how the Fire Sprite Shrine and the plains that surround it have been made habitable by Bisochim because there are fountains just spraying into the air all the time. And he's very, very glad to get to the top. He figures he's going to quench his thirst at one of the fountains, and then he will go and see Bisochim. Unfortunately, but when he reached the top of the pale sandstone staircase, instead of turning left to refresh himself at the fountain that he could see beyond the low wall, Narbak found his steps turning right and leading him forward across the wide, flat area at the top of the stair towards a second staircase cut into the wall of the black cliff ahead. His mind screamed with terror, but he could not give voice to his fear any more than he could command his body to turn back. He was helpless as the Shenshu in a Fenric's jaws, and his limbs did not obey his will. Within his thoughts, Narbak wept and begged for whatever power had taken possession of him to release him, but all he could do was climb higher along the face of the cliff. The heat that he had felt before was nothing as to this. That had been the heat of the sun, but this was the heat of fire. Now, Narbak is being puppeted, and he doesn't know by what, but whatever is taking control of his body has him not only climb to the top of this stairway, but then start climbing the cliff, even though every touch of his skin on the rocks is actually giving him burns. Like he's feeling his flesh just sear and burn, and he wants to scream, he wants to run, but something is just compelling him forward until he gets to the lake of fire. And as suddenly as the compulsion hit him, it was lifted. He begins to scream, and then he looks up. That was when he saw her. A woman stood upon the surface of the boiling rock. She wore no clothing, and her skin was as pale as if it had never been touched by the sun. It shone with reflections, orange and gold and white, of the fires that she walked through untouched. Her hair was long enough that it might have fallen to her knees unbound and uncovered as a young girl might go into her mother's tent. It was of a color Narbak had never seen, and in its golds and pale reds it made him think of metal and fire, though it lifted in the wind like the veil of softest, finest linen in the breeze. And though the rock beneath his feet burned him, though the agony of standing so close to the scorching cliff was only extended by the agony of moving away from it, still, Narbak had to stop and see. The woman held her arms out to him, beckoning. Come. But the compulsion has been lifted, and he won't come. He can't really leave because every step is like fire and standing still is like fire, but he just doesn't, he just stands there, deer in the headlights. And she begins to come towards him. She begins walking slowly towards him, and he can see puffs of flame that are coming up from every footfall across this lake of fire. And she's smiling at him. And thankfully, she still is not compelling him because he is able to do one final thing, knowing that whatever she has in mind for him is probably 10,000 times worse than the knife at his belt. He pulls the knife at his belt and does away with himself. Then we transfer over to Bisochim. And Bisochim is down in his little secret area, completely unaware that the fire woman who he's been talking to is up top at the Lake of Fire killing one of his people. He is down in his little obsidian bubble far below the Lake of Fire where he does all of his most serious spell work. And he's practicing for his most important spell ever. Now, he also has summoned up the Fire Crown, which is the elemental spirit that he had summoned to send after Tercel because he figures that, here in the Fire Sprite Shrine, this echo of their former god should probably be enough to be like a safeguard. He wants like a bodyguard because he is planning on doing his penultimate spell and doing it today because he is very worried that the reports that he's heard of Tercel as a dragon-bound mage means that there's probably going to be more dragon-bound mages coming for him, and he's just going to have to hurry up and do his great spell. For many years, he had known what his work must be: to call darkness back into the world, into a form of flesh that he would craft to house it, and then to trap that fleshy form in spells of stasis and stone. Thus, darkness would be returned to the world, but safely powerless. He thought that he might be able to do it in several months, but he actually has to do it now. The spells that he must cast, if his plan were to succeed, were complex and delicate. First, the flesh form must be created, a body identical in every way to one birthed by any woman and raised to adulthood through many wheels of seasons. Next, he must summon the elemental spirit of darkness to inhabit it and bind the spirit to its flesh form. Either spell would be the masterwork of an elven mage, the capstone of a life of study. Bisochim must not only prepare and cast both, but he must cast them as closely together as two heartbeats, for he could only leave the flesh form untenanted for the space of 100 heartbeats before it would be unfit for habitation. And having cast those two spells, he must cast a third and a fourth, or else he would have done nothing more than to have released darkness into the world again, unchained. So, this is Bisochim's grand plan, and he's feeling pretty good about it. He takes a moment to speak to the Fire Crown, that's Tercel's red man, and he's like, "All right, are you ready? You're gonna be here. You're gonna help me." The Fire Crown says, "You summoned me up from darkness and sent me forth into the world. Now you have summoned me home as attendant and witness to that which is your great purpose. Be certain I stand ready to do all that is needed." Bisochim thinks that that's probably good enough and begins his final practice spell. He casts the spells and almost brings this perfect form to life. It looks like an absolutely perfect Isvani woman, beautiful in every way, and then he unmakes it because now it's the time. The danger was great. If he called the spirit of darkness to a form into which he could not bind it, one that was too weak to hold it, or one that ceased to live before the spirit came to tenant it, he would merely loose the creature upon the world in an elemental form, and he would not be able to bind it. It would go free to wander the land like some terrible plague, unable to truly claim a body of its own, but destroying hundreds, no thousands, in its attempts to try. Yet if his work remained undone, when his enemies reached the plain, the long labor of years would all be for nothing, and centuries of destruction and error might pass before another was called, as he had, to this holy purpose. Bisochim takes a deep breath after thinking about his holy purpose, and he begins. He pours power into his spell of making, and soon there's a mist on the altar that he has prepared, and there we go. laying on the stone, looking as if she merely slept, was a woman who might have drunk kafea unnoticed in any of the tents below. Her skin was the pale amber of wild honey, and her hair as black and shining as the stone upon which she lay. She was perfect in every way. All she lacked was the spark of life. Visochim goes ahead and does that spark. And he weaves his spells, and there we go. Bisochim had spent years of his life journeying as a spirit through the realms of what once was, seeking answers to his questions. And he has found what he thinks are his answers. So, into this perfect female body that he has created, he slips one of the elemental spirits of darkness free from its prison, and he binds it to the flesh. And she awakens. She arose gracefully to her feet and shook out her long flowing hair. I have given you form, as I promised your masters I would do, and it is for you to grant the payment that I will name for the service I rendered, said Bisochim. Immortality would be his. The voices in the fire had told him the gift would be within the spirit's power to grant. His immortality would gain immortality for Saravase as well. The woman laughed. Her laughter, wild and cold, rang from the walls of the black glass chamber, and when she met his eyes, Bisochim saw, with a thrill of disquiet, that they were not black, as he had expected them to be, but a bright hawk gold. Her lips curved in a mocking smile. It is I who will choose the coin of your payment, wild mage, not you. Foolish creature of clay, did you really think you could presume to call Aniran to you, as if she were your hound, and chain her up once she had done your bidding? You are fortunate that I do not strike the life from your body in this instant. The voices in the fire sang a mocking song of triumph, and Bisochim suddenly knew he had been betrayed. He turns to the fire crown because he tries to bind Aniran, and she shrugs it off. So he turns to the fire crown asking for help, and Aniran says, "Oh, wild mage, you are a fool." Aniran knelt down before him, gazing into his eyes, and try as he might, Bisochim could neither look away nor raise a hand against her. I was born in fire, and fire knows its own. The names of those who once called upon the fire crown are no longer known. Their songs and dances are not remembered. The children of water have taken all of their places, and you have made of holy fire a thing that you kill 1,000 times a day with air and water. The dark killed all the children of the stars, even as they begged for the aid of their god, and the fire crown did nothing to save his own children. And yet you think he will help you? She laughs and says, no, don't look to him to help. Then she turns and addresses Bisochim again. I was willing to allow you to spread darkness across the land at my side. Not only immortality, wild mage, for both you and your pet, but power such as even the kings of men have never dreamed of. You should have worshipped me for my beauty. Instead, you choose to demand payment. I should strike you dead for such insolence. But I will give you one more chance to freely yield to me. Beneath my hand, you will gain such knowledge as you have never imagined. Bisochim, to his credit, tries to bind her again. She laughs and calls him a fool and lets him know that No spell any wild mage can cast can kill her now that she has been given form. Bisochim again turns to the fire crown and commands that he destroy her. And the fire crown asks, "How are you to command me without understanding? And yet, I say this to you. The task that you first gave me is not yet complete." Again, Aniran laughs, and then she turns and lightly runs towards the doorway and up the flight of steps, leaving Bisochim and the fire crown down in the obsidian area. And as Bisochim rounds to yell at the fire crown, probably, the fire crown's also gone. But not before letting Bisochim know that he should go look after his people. So Bisochim begins to head up. And as he goes up the long steps, he thinks about the fact that he was wrong and he was stupid, and that in doing what he thought was right, he seems to have doomed the whole world. And then he thinks about the one, Saravase. She had begged him 1,000 times to turn away from this quest for knowledge, and he had refused. She had grown cold and silent and distant, and Bisochim had told himself that when he had secured immortality for her, he would have centuries to win back her love. Instead, he had secured nothing but her hatred, and the hatred of every living creature, all through arrogance and pride. Bisochim, the greatest of the blue robes. He had drunk so deeply of their praise in the years of his youth that he had poisoned himself with it. And that is the frame of mind he is in when he gets up to the top of his fortress and looks out towards all of the Isvani. He looks towards them and he realizes that something's very wrong because they are all moving as a unit towards him. He thinks maybe they know. Maybe they know and they're coming to kill him, and that's probably justice, even though it will end up killing Saravase. He doesn't know what to do. Then he saw her. She was at the very base of the cliff, seated upon a shotar such as had never been foaled, for its coat was as black as a Jarari's carapace. Its saddle and lead rope were not such as any of the Isvani would ever use, for the saddle gleamed with beaten gold, and the lead rope was of a silk as red as blood. It was the same color as the billowing desert robes that she wore, thin scarlet silk that the hot winds molded against the curves of her slim body. She looked up towards him, and he saw her white teeth flash in a smile of mocking triumph. "Oh, wild mage, you are a fool." It almost seemed to Bisochim that he could hear her voice whispering in his mind, just as the voices in the fire had whispered for so very long. And in that moment, he truly began to understand the horror of what he had done. He had brought darkness back into the world and clothed it in flesh. He thinks that Aniran might actually be worse than what the people of light had called demons, the Undarkened. He also thinks that if she could make more of her own kind, this is just going to be another race of the Undarkened. And now, Aniran, meant to feed, just as the Undarkened once had fed. His Isvani were not coming to seek him out. They were coming, at Aniran's summoning, to ascend the steps that led to the lake of fire and throw themselves into it. He thinks he's got to stop this. He can't let all of his people throw himself into the lake of fire just for Aniron's amusement. So he tries to cast a spell on Aniron. Nothing. He tries to cast a spell on the Isvani. Nothing. He tries everything that he can think of. He throws spell after spell after spell, and nothing is working. So then he turns to his fortress and begins to unmake it. And thinking, that'll stop them. If they can't get to the lake of fire to throw themselves into it, well then, that should work. And he begins to turn this fortress back into sand, and the lake of fire continues to spill out because Aniron is pouring her magic into it. And so, to try to save his people, the spells he had cast hours ago had required utmost delicacy, but this one required nothing but force and power. Those things a dragon-bound wild mage had to the last beat of his heart. For long moments, as the cliffs moaned and keened above him, nothing happened. Then softly at first, then with ever-increasing force, a wind rose, cold as no wind in the furnace of the Barileth ever was. The sky began to boil, with dark clouds scudding west, south, and east, until in moments the bright day turned dim. There was a dangerous rumble of thunder, a bright flash of light in the sky, and then came something that had never been seen in the Barileth in all of its tens of thousands of years of existence. Rain. And that, with it raining in a part of the desert that has never seen rain before, in Disochim's desperate attempt to cool off the lake of fire and frustrate Aniron's grand plans to kill all of the Isvani, is where the chapter ends. Now, the next chapter, we'll see what Tercel and Harrier and everybody else has been doing during this time, but that will be our next adventure. So I hope that you guys are as excited about this book as I am. It is a very, it's not gory brutal, but this is a very brutal story. And it's a good one, though. It really is. And it's funny because you would think that I would be completely inured to brutality in stories. I cut my teeth on Stephen King, and a lot of the authors that I like don't shy away from it, but it did kind of surprise me a little bit. Especially the bit at the beginning of that chapter with the guy that cuts his own throat is very descriptive. It's very descriptive, but it's a good chapter nonetheless. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that recap, and I will see you next time.